A questo punto, con un leggero ritardo di soli 9 minuti, do il benvenuto a Maria Buhigas, a quale la invito a unirsi a noi, accendere la webcam e il microfono. Maria, benvenuta.
Muchas gracias.
Grazie di essere con
Piacere.
noi. Grazie. Non so quanto sei riuscita a seguire delle presentazioni precedenti, se hai avuto modo, se no comunque sono registrate su YouTube, quindi avremo piacere di avere anche la tua opinione su questo. Nel ringraziarti di essere con noi, ti lascio subito la parola per la tua keynote di chiusura della nostra scuola. Grazie ancora di essere con noi.
Grazie, Luigi. I'm sorry not being able to speak in Italian, coming from Barcelona and from Catalonia, which our languages are quite similar. So it's really sad. I look through just at the end of your presentations, but I haven't had the option to follow the final presentations. I'm really sorry. These are busy days. But before preparing the presentation for today as a part of the closing keynotes, I was also looking through the different speakers that along these days have shared with you ideas and projects and many other things. Luigi, I'm not sure if I can share screen. Yes, I think I can do it. Okay.
Assolutamente sì, il tasto
perfetto.
è quello al centro, in basso, a fianco. Perfetto.
Okay, let me see. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Vediamo.
Yeah, perfect. Well, when Luigi invited me to give this short keynote, I suggest him to this title: Challenges, Myths, and Opportunities in the Current Urban World. And basically what I will try in the coming 30, 40 minutes ahead is to share with you reflections, thoughts, and experiences from my own city, but not only, also from my work in other countries, in Latin America and in other places, regarding the construction of the city nowadays, today, how we are constructing this built environment in which we are living most of the population. As you have already heard many times along these days of the course and before that, over half of the world population is becoming urban. And here you can see the distribution among the different countries around the world. And over 90% of this urbanization is taking place in developing countries. So basically, who is talking right now is talking from a developed country, so one of these greens here in Europe. But most of this urbanization will take place in other places, in developing countries, in a speed that it's really challenging the capacity of governments to deal with that. And basically because we say that over half of the population will be living in urbanized, will become urban. But when we say urban, unfortunately, 1 in 4 of these people will end up living in slums, what means that may be urban, but not are places that won't have the conditions that we usually consider minimum acceptable for not only calling an urban experience or a city, but also that they are conditions in terms of health or housing affordability or enjoyable of public spaces and so on, that we may call them urbanized world. And at the same time, we already know, now that we are more and more aware of the climate crisis that we really and definitely have to face, is that 70% of the emissions of climate change are produced by cities, either by traffic, either by buildings, the buildings and these heating and cooling processes, as well as the urban footprint that goes beyond the city borders that we might not see, but this footprint still is there. So in a way, the challenges are already on the table. We know them for long. And then suddenly, 2 years ago, well, 1 year more or less ago, we all together as a, in this, for the first time, as a sense of the entire planet, we are still, because we are still within this pandemic, but it was suddenly, it was a kind of Kit Kat. It was kind of a breaking point. And many things were said at the beginning of this pandemic, have been said along these months, and we will see in the coming future also a lot of talks, a lot of reflections, and a lot of ideas coming into the table regarding these lessons from the pandemic. And I wanted to highlight from this text this idea of certain ideas that may appear when something like a pandemic happens, then suddenly force us to rethink the future of cities. I was asked for a conference as well during that first 2 months of the lockdown, and I proposed the idea not so much of forcing us to rethink, but a little bit more about the pandemic. What changed is our point of view regarding things that we have been looking at in the same direction, from the same perspective, with the same approach. Suddenly we have the chance to look differently. And why I'm saying that? Because at that time, there are always the risk of this idea of early predictions that may talk about the end of the city, or the impact of this idea of the office footprints, or how this pandemic will change and we will go into a new reality, or the new paradigm, or this kind of narrative that it's always talking about a new in a very fast way. I'm a little bit skeptical on that, and let me put you some examples why I'm so skeptical regarding these issues. The pandemic, it was really a point of inflection, what means that we were coming through in a certain trend, and the pandemic is that changing that trend, or it's just a discontinuity. So that we basically means that we were getting in a certain direction, and there is a kind of discontinuous, this idea of the lockdown, this Kit Kat, this pause, and then we will keep moving forward, looking to reestablish at the starting point when we left the things. These are two images well known of the flight traffic in Europe. One is from March 2019, and the other one is from March 2020, when we were all blocked down at home. But this is from today. So probably if I look at the statistics, it's not exactly the same one as in 2019, but definitely it looks more alike than, of course, the 2020. So in a way, this kind of point of inflection, it might be a point of inflection, but it might be closer to a discontinuity. Also, for example, regarding this idea of the remote, the teleworking, this staying at home, and thanks to the new technologies, we will be able to work from home. Well, these are two news from local newspapers here in Barcelona. And on the left side, it says that the working from home, this idea of the remote working and all these Zoom teams whatsoever have been reduced. Half of the people that was working at home after a year of the pandemic. And at the same time, and this is from July, and the new that it's on the right side is from today, and it says the investment in office spaces is getting to the same level and in record numbers in Barcelona. What basically means that the market in terms of investment, and we will need more time to understand who will be occupying these office spaces, what for, when, how, and so on. But literally, again, we can see that this point of inflection, we have to, it's need a little bit more detail on what we mean by the impact of this pandemic when we look at the trends and the dynamics in a city. Also, I want to raise UN Habitat and the World Health Organization held an event looking at something that also raised up during the pandemic, that it's again and over this idea that density and cities were, places where the disease transmission was higher than in other places. And again, apparently certain discourses against the city or against compactness and density raise up once again. And these two organizations come together and pointed out that they were no evidences, they were not clear findings that density and diversity of uses, compactness by themselves, was associated with higher incidence. In fact, what they were looking at is that there was if the conditions of cities were in terms of water provision, in terms of the relationship between public spaces and building spaces, the housing conditions and so on. These poor conditions were dangerous and were in fact let's say there were conditions for this transmission, while on the other hand, when density and diversity with adequate housing conditions, and this is important, this idea of the adequate conditions in front of overcrowding, of lack of services, of poor conditions. In this case, when we give these urban environments with the adequate conditions, in fact, they not only cannot be associated with higher incidence or impact of the COVID, but also these spaces become easier to and facilitate to give the health services and to control that, and for the population to be able to cover all their needs in terms of food, in terms of, for example, the kids, the school, through these technological infrastructures that may be easier to find in compact and in dense areas than in other sprawl and dispersed areas. But here I wanted to point that at that moment raise once again this idea that urban environments by default, they are always like these places where instead of being the solution, it's just the accumulation of problems. And I wanted to raise here how these two organizations come into the front saying, well, it depends of what we call the adequate conditions. And here they come up with this report, this integrating health in urban and territorial planning, something that on the other hand is not new at all. All the people, all the professionals that we are involved with urban planning, we already know that the planning comes from exactly from introducing this idea of health into urban environments from the industrial area until now, so that this is something that we might forget over time, but at the beginning of the planning practices of the modern city, health was at the center. So we were once again looking at the industrial city, looking at the externalities, the unhealthy conditions, and planning a peer trying to solve and to improve these conditions, putting health at the center. So here, this report reminds us, and I would like to say reminds us, because most of the things we already know, the 5 qualifiers that we have to provide in these urban environments. The idea of compactness, connectivity, integration, resilience, and inclusiveness. And I won't go into that detail, because these are things that we go over and over on these labels, on these ideas. But on the other hand, it seems that we don't move forward. We still have all that challenges that I was referring at the beginning of my presentations were before and previous to the pandemic, and once the pandemic, and we are still within that pandemic, these issues are still on the table. We haven't solved the problems yet. And I wanted to share today with you some approaches how we move forward. And I wanted to refer to Jorge Wagensberg, a professor, researcher, and writer that unfortunately left us 2 years ago, that he, using a sentence from Einstein, he was always provoking us, saying, changing the answer is evolution, changing the question is revolution. And I think that at this point, we have to force ourselves into the second sentence. So we have tried too many times to change the answer, but we are right now facing issues that we really need to change the question, because we really need to help to be part, or to start this revolution, in order to overcome all these challenges that I was putting at the beginning. But can we try to change the question? And here I will refer to these 2 professors from MIT. They were Nobel Prize of Economy a couple of years ago, and I strongly recommended this book, Poor Economics, Rethinking Poverty. And in this book, Professor Banerjee and Duflo, they talk about the 3 I's: ideology, ignorance, and inertia. And for me, after, I'm still working as a planner, but I also have been involved into local politics. So one can say I've been in both sides, the decision takers, and at the same time as professional and planner and the technical part. I realize more and more that one of the main constraints in order to face this idea of changing the question are these 3 I's. And let me put you some examples. In terms of ideology, I'm referring to these dominant narratives regarding cities, where these narratives that tend to simplify. Density is bad, green is good. Now green is like the new word. Everything has to be green. We have to greener the cities, no matter where these cities are located on the planet. While we all know that there are many different ways to green something, if we mean by that to guarantee open spaces, certain quality of that community spaces, shadows, permeable surfaces, but not necessarily green, not necessarily the imaginary of these green grasses from, in the case of Europe, North European countries where there is a kind of rain and weather that we don't have in the South, for example. Also, this idea, this narrative of the service economy as something that would replace yes manufacturing, or would replace primary sector, when we already know, and if something the pandemic has shown us is the interconnection between the primary sector, in other words, the agriculture, and the urban centers where service economies are located. But it doesn't mean that the service economy may appear in the cities as replacement from other kind of economies. And just putting an example, how many cities have reconvert industrial areas into service economy, forgetting at all its capacity to be able to manufacture or to develop by themselves science and technological solutions for that environment. Also, the misunderstanding between planning and real estate, and how many times we listen to narratives that they are focused on the idea of real estate products, and we don't talk anymore about planning issues, and understanding that we are not only developing buildable spaces, but also these spaces have to be able to create the conditions for the final users to be occupied. And this means not only in the physical conditions, but also in terms, for example, of affordability. And this is something that it's on the table right now regarding housing. And also this, in the dominant narratives, the idea that the technology by itself will solve all the problems that we are facing right now. Ignorance, what I mean by ignorance is this ignorance of the dynamics that operate on the cities. And why I'm saying this is because the urban concepts that we have been working with along the 21st century are becoming more and more fuzzy. So what happens basically is that we are facing issues in our cities, not necessarily with the right knowledge and the right data and the right understanding and a profound understanding of what are these dynamics. For example, let me put you a couple of examples. In my city, in Barcelona, accordingly to the official statistics, the number of inhabitants in the city is 1.7 million people, more or less. But we already know, thanks to a survey, that there are almost 200,000 people that they are not counted in that statistics. This is almost the size of a borough of the city. This is a huge amount of people. This is close to 80,000 units of housing that we may need. So these are kind of things. Why? Because we have global citizens moving around the world, maybe staying in Barcelona for 2-3 years. They don't for the kind of life, for the profile, they don't need educational service or health services. So they don't care to be part of, like to be countable in terms of that statistics. They are global citizens, but they are not counted here. But of course, they use the city as well. Also, in terms of urban concepts, housing, we used to have a clear understanding what means a housing unit and a place where, an industrial place or an office space. Nowadays, what is housing unit? It's only for permanent living, it's a residential use, or it can be also vacational through Airbnb and other, platforms. Or right now, it's at the same time the office space and the residential space, how permanent is. All these concepts are becoming fuzzy more and more. And we don't have the statistics at this point in many of the cities that we work with. We don't have the statistics to give us answers to take the right decisions regarding these issues. Many times we have to take decisions far away, from the without the evidences, so that we are in a position that it's far away from the reality, and we have to make sure that we are taking the right decision. This is quite complicated. And finally, the inertia in legislations. How many laws and regulations come from a reality that doesn't fit anymore to the current reality, the reality that we are facing right now? How many processes of decision taking and working in many administrations are, the result of this inertia? We have been doing that for the last 40 years in the same way, right? But not even the society is the same one. In 40 years, it has changed so much. There are much more conflicts to deal with in these cities, because the society has become also much more heterogeneous. So many of these legislations, laws and regulations were designed in a time where the society, for example, was much more homogeneous than nowadays. And these are creating constraints and difficulties. And there are also inertias in the results and the outcomes, because if we point out the same question, it's probably that we get the same answers. And that's the reason why I think that we have to push ourselves to try to think in new questions, to try to change the questions. Now I will share with you some examples of these ideas of the inertia, the ideology, the ignorance, and the inertia. We already know where, low density model of, residential come from. But even though one may see, no, this is something from the 50s, even the 70s, nowadays still on TV. We still can look at TV, what basically means that it's creating an imaginarium in the whole population that is aspirational. So people is willing to not to have an apartment, it's willing to still having a house with a car in front of it, even though it's electric, that car, and a small garden for themselves. And we already know and have the evidences that the cost associated to each one is completely different. So that there is no way to give public housing, affordable housing, and many other things. We cannot have a mixed society in a certain area if we follow a suburban model. And this is in Canada, but I will show you, these are figures from my own country, which is closer, for example, probably to the experience in Italy. And you can see here that when we are talking about densities, that in the case of Barcelona, we have this idea of the 75 housing units per hectare in gross, or in net, you have 300. But you can see the two models. The urbanization cost per housing unit doubles one to the other. But this one can say, well, it doubles, it's not so much. But I want you to look at this one. This is the maintainment, because once the city is done, is developed, and we know that there are many ways to find the investment and the finance tools to develop that city. The problem comes the day after, once it's occupied, because then the public administration has to maintain that streets, the light, has to collect the garbage, has to bring public transportation, has to put all that services, because people is expecting this to happen. But suddenly the cost here is quite different, when in these kind of models of realities, people not necessarily pay the taxes accordingly. So at a certain point, I'm sorry to say, but these three eyes also put us in front of our own contradictions. We cannot necessarily live whatever we want, because the costs associated are unsustainable over time. And here you have, again, the same on private cost. Let me share with you some figures from Barcelona. This is something that we have been doing recently, and it shows, again, the square meters, built square meters per hectare, and it's dividing the city into these, the 20,000 square meters per hectare of built space is where more or less you can see from 20,000 towards 30,000 is more or less where it lives, the experience that lives half of the population in the city. Okay, you can see, and I will show you that this is the Cerdà grid, well known all around the world. On the left side, you have the old Eixample, the one that was built over 100 years, and these some of these buildings just start at the beginning of the 20th century. Some of them are more recent, but this layout with this lotting and all that structure give us, this is the amount of square meters per hectare that it's built in this area. This is the Olympic Village. This was built in 1992. Look at the different intensity for the same grid. What has happened here is the planning regulation. We have shifted from here towards this regulation that at this point, we will need at least 4 times the same surface to put all these people, all these square meters into this scheme. But the problem of that is one can argue, wow, this is too dense, and we will come again with this myth of the density. Let me show you this image. This is for the entire city. We have erased, we haven't considered in these figures the poor as the hill on the back of the city. We just have looked at the built space. And look at what show us the figures. Basically, for the entire city, only 1/4 of the surface is really built with buildings up on 2 stories. The rest, so 3/4 of the city, 75%, is divided between 44% are just empty spaces, non-built areas, mostly green spaces, parks, but mostly also streets. Then within the blocks, we still have a 23% of space that can be reoccupied with, if we want to greener, we want to create shadows, we want to increase these areas where people can be out of the building spaces, can be all these can be permeable, and we want to change that proportion. It's great. We can do it. We have a lot of space. What I'm referring here is that not necessarily the idea of these compactness in front of these apparently less, apparently better with more empty spaces and so on, we have tons of spaces in the city because this is not the majority. This is, as you can see here, this is where lives only 13% of the population, which means that we have a lot of room in our already built cities to change these inertias. Again, regulations. Look at these 2 images. Same regulations in this case, same densities, but the result has nothing to do one to the other. These are inertias in regulations. These are, we have lost something here in between that we may recover, or we have to look at that and see, okay, what's the city we want to build? Is this one? What happens? Because now when we try to build that, the outcome is this one, that it's clearly not the same. Again, this is globally. We are facing globally, there is a crisis in housing. And even though we know that these solutions are not the answer, we keep building millions of these housing units all over the world, until the point that in Mexico, there are 4 million of these houses unoccupied. They have been abandoned, which means that we have wasted over 320 million square meters of land have been wasted. But if you go to many countries, we still see housing policies with these kind of solutions, even though we already know that these are not the solutions. Again, this is not only for housing or mass housing solutions. We can see also when we look at these corporate architectures, these are 4 different cities around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, and in America, and they look all alike. How can be that? Because the imperative narrative is showing that this is the answer, and this is the result of ideology, ignorance, and inertia. And I'm sorry to say that when I see at this response regarding the public spaces after pandemia, I have to tell you that I'm really a little bit concerned. I understand the point, and I understand the, let's say, the momentum that we have all had after the lockdown to go into the streets, to conquer that spaces. But what is behind this idea, in fact, is a new distribution of the public spaces that for too long, the cars and the private transport have been the one putting the rules. And I totally agree with this approach. I'm wondering if we are aware that it's not by doing only these kind of solutions that we will be able to change these conditions, because what it's really happening is that we are not putting in parallel other kind of policies, plans, and programs, basically to reduce cars on the street, in all the streets, no matter if they are painted or not, no matter if they belong to a superilla or not, because that's the real problem. So I totally agree, we can paint them, we can conquer them, we can use them, but we have to have an overall strategy, and we have to look at that, because at the same time, my government at the national level is giving thousands of millions to the car industry to become electric. So at the end of the day, what will happen? Is the problem gone once all the cars will become electric? I don't think so. So what is the overall issue that we are trying to change? Is by doing these tactical expressions that we will really, in a permanent way, solve that problem, changing that dynamic? Again, with the bicycles, it's great that we are putting bicycles. My concern is that in certain cities and countries, this is becoming an excuse for not delivering public transportation in quality and intensity enough. It's fine, we have to promote bicycle, but not in the substitution of many other things, because at the end of the day, who will be using that space is not the majority of the city. And we were talking at the beginning of creating these conditions that may not left, that might not left anyone behind. So these are solutions, definitely. These are expressions of what we aim to achieve, definitely. Are these really changing the question? Are we really tackling the real issue? That's my concern. And then let me go to the idea of technology. Technology might be the answer. I'm not always sure about that, because, and I like this picture, what was the question? Because, and I'm arriving to the end of my presentation, let me put you this picture of Pompeii that dates from the 7th century before Christus, where, let me put you these 2 images. One is of one street in Pompeii, and another one is of one street in my city. And of course, there are differences, but mostly we are still there in the same place. So, and for me, the main lesson learned from here is that, on the one hand, it's not only about technology, science, design, and technology that over time and a long history has helped us to evolve and improve the conditions of our the living conditions of our cities, that not all that we have to avoid thinking that we are always discovering everything as new, because at the end we are the accumulation of previous experiences, and that's fine. And probably most of our work at this point is to separate where it's really the essences of, you know, what really creates that condition and will guarantee that adequate conditions for living, from all these other things that are against our own existence in life. Also, I work a lot in industrial areas, and I like to explain that industrial areas for a city is like the kitchen, the baths, and the place where we clean our clothes and so on, and how over time and a long history, these places are still part of our houses, as the industrial areas are still part of our cities, or streets are still part of our urban settlements, and how science, design, and technology has helped us to adequate the conditions over time. And therefore, changing the question for me, instead of would mean to put the question, what if? What if we build upon evidences and realities, and then we change the questions that we want to make in our cities, and stop using the statistics, and we try to change that statistics and shape them in a way that help us to create these evidences according to the realities that we are facing. That also, what if we question our own assumptions? What if we try scenarios where we can evaluate real impact? What about clarify goals and objectives in a realistic manner, and we stop doing these huge plans where there are at least 50 different objectives and goals that we all know won't be achievable in a reasonable period of time? What if we change processes and regulations? And finally, and using the last sentence of that book of Rethinking Poverty, what if we stop pretending there is some simple solution? There may be thousands of efforts, and instead join hands with millions of people around the world in search for many ideas, big and small, that one day will lead us to that world in which we can continue to inhabit that. My presentation will finish at this point. I hope that some of these reflections that I have shared with you will inspire for keeping working all together, searching for these ideas, no matter how big or small, using science, design, and technology. Thank you very much.
Grazie a te Maria per questa bellissima presentazione. Io, come hai detto,
I'm not sure if
quella frase del professore di Barcellona me la sono subito scritta. Che dobbiamo cambiare non le risposte, dobbiamo cambiare le domande, dobbiamo farci domande diverse. Finché non ci faremo domande diverse, saranno solo variazioni delle stesse situazioni, ma non ci sarà veramente una rivoluzione. Questa frase riesce in pochissimo a concentrare un pensiero molto profondo. Devo dire che mi ha veramente colpito. Tutte le tue considerazioni di fatto sono considerazioni che ci portano e ci devono portare a riflettere su come dovremmo agire nei confronti delle città, del nostro futuro, in realtà, perché poi le città non sono nient'altro che una rappresentazione del nostro modo di vivere. E a ben guardare, se le guardiamo con un minimo di stacco, come hai sottolineato, questa nostra modalità richiede un cambiamento forte, un cambiamento che vede la partecipazione di tutti, non solo di alcuni. Finché non cercheremo di porci le domande in modo giusto, cosa che devo dirti richiama un'altra, la keynote dell'anno scorso, era la keynote di apertura di Stefano Epifani, che sarà nostro ospite nella tavola rotonda, e lo stesso lui in effetti portò un esempio simile, perché durante la keynote portò l'esempio di un libro, l'esempio, se ricordo correttamente, era un libro di fantascienza dove veniva posta a un supercomputer la domanda sul fine ultimo dell'esistenza, il senso, no, finale di tutto. E lui disse: datemi un po' di tempo perché devo elaborare, ci rivediamo tra 300.000 anni, non mi ricordo esattamente, ma un tempo molto lungo. Passano tutti questi anni, arriva il giorno della risposta, sono tutti lì davanti, ansiosi di sapere la risposta. Grande festa, grande momento, il supercomputer risponde che la risposta alla vostra domanda è 42. Ma come 42? Sì, perché avete sbagliato domanda. Cioè, il problema non è la risposta, ma che era stata posta male la domanda. Quindi è simile, l'idea è questa: noi dobbiamo farci non solo cambiare domande, ma dobbiamo farci le domande giuste.
No, and Luigi, if I may, I'm really sorry to speak in English. I can speak in Catalan or in Spanish if you want, but no. And this idea of la demanda, of the question, in fact, is something that challenges and nos interpela the architects or the designers, because we are used to put questions, to change the questions. The first thing that we do as architects, or when a client come, is to change or to question the question that he's pointing us. We always do that. When you get a project, the first thing that you do is to question, the task. This is the first thing. So in a way, we are trained to question our own work continuously, and I think that we have the chance to help around us to be part of this questioning our own statements, our approach, which is not easy, and people doesn't feel comfortable because, well, sometimes means to question something that may be like, no, this is my soul. No, it's we need to question things. I totally agree, and I like the anecdote of that you were just saying.
Ora, noi avremmo l'intervento di Natalia Garcia de Castro, che pare abbia qualche problema di connessione, quindi io ne approfitterei per continuare a chiacchierare con te, se tu hai tempo, ovviamente.
Yes, I do. I have some time. I love to.
Benissimo, mi fa molto piacere. Quindi ripartendo un po' dall'idea che stiamo sbagliando le domande da porci, no? Che dovremmo porci tutti delle domande diverse. Dobbiamo cambiare il paradigma con cui guardiamo la realtà. Io ho questa idea che porto avanti da un po', e cioè il fatto che sostanzialmente anche questo modo di considerare le città a livello istituzionale, intendo anche il concetto stesso di smart city, che lo ritroviamo utilizzato sia a livello di società come società multinazionali, e lo portano avanti forse più per vendere il loro prodotto che per altro, ma anche a livello stesso di istituzioni europee, che considera il concetto stesso come però un qualcosa che riporta allo stesso identico paradigma, un po' come dicevi, di fondo cambiano la risposta ma mantenendo la stessa domanda. La domanda è sempre: come facciamo a essere più ricchi? Come facciamo a incrementare il PIL? E se la domanda è sempre la stessa, la risposta in questo caso diventa: aumenta il livello tecnologico della città. Prima era aumenta la produttività, però è sempre la stessa domanda, stiamo cambiando modo di rispondere alla stessa domanda. Neanche le smart city, se non il concetto della smart city, o comunque lo si voglia chiamare, continua a rispondere alla stessa domanda, continuiamo a trovare risposte non molto diverse. E da un punto di vista, diciamo, di paradigma di sviluppo economico, il riferimento rimane la crescita neoclassica. Non stiamo cambiando,
No.
non stiamo modificando assolutamente il nostro paradigma di riferimento. Tant'è che io continuo a trovare, forse in questo sono un po' talebano, continuo a trovare la parola crescita e un po' mi infastidisce, perché vorrei trovare la parola sviluppo. È vero che abbiamo gli SDGs, però poi quando vengono tradotti sembra che la finalità sia sempre una problematica relativa alla crescita. Anche oggi, stiamo ascoltando il telegiornale, sono tutti preoccupati del fatto che l'incremento del numero di contagiati a cui stiamo assistendo in questi giorni possa in qualche modo inficiare la crescita del PIL che l'Italia stava registrando, che tutti contenti in Italia perché finalmente avevamo la crescita del PIL di un valore che non era decimale, ma finalmente aveva almeno un valore oltre il decimale, e sono tutti preoccupati che il numero di contagiati possa diminuire il PIL. Io credo che sia folle che questo sia il problema. Forse dovremmo preoccuparci di ciò che questo comporta per le persone, per le famiglie, non che intacchi il nostro livello di PIL, ma il nostro livello di benessere, il benessere della popolazione, il benessere, la vita delle persone, anche perché il PIL cresce anche se aumenta paradossalmente il numero degli ospedalizzati. Quindi è un po' un paradosso, questa situazione.
No, but Luigi, sometimes when now I'm working in Barcelona, for example, for the city council in the revision of our general master plan, the metropolitan plan, that it's from 1976. Can you imagine how old is the general master plan? And what it's amazing is that we are not prepared yet to confront our own contradictions. And that's why I'm saying this idea of what people is willing to, the kind of places that they are willing to live, even though we already know that they are not sustainable. So in a way, it's the same thing that you are saying right now, that this idea of the keeping growing, and because we still have this way of measure what means wealth. But at this point, I'm start to be a little bit optimistic for two reasons. One is that, but we need to work hard on that to become real smart. That is to create evidences that show that what are the costs and the different costs between keeping on this trend and changing. It's like in many developing countries, I ask them, you have to measure the cost, the difference of the cost between doing something or not doing it. You don't want to change. Perfect. What is the cost of not changing? What is the cost of changing? Of course, all of them have costs. But at the end of the day, this will be one of the choices. On the other hand, in Europe, at the same time, at the European Union, they are developing something called the EU taxonomy that has to do with the impact of any kind of investment in development. I'm quite optimistic after looking a little bit on that, because we start to create tools that interlinks the impact on, impact by impact. Where is the level of, so in order to avoid the greenwashing, so we will be forced to demonstrate that our investment in cities, in environments, in urban environments, in development, what is the impact, the negative impact that has in front of the positive. I know that there are a lot of, shortcuts to show that everything is good. We already know these kind of things. But I think that we are walking in a direction that starts to show, that pointed and raises questions regarding, okay, that's fine. Apparently, it seems that it's good, but what is real? And here we have the chance to put a question, and we need the evidences, we need the data. So when I hear smart cities, my only concern is that we are not, or not necessarily we are putting the efforts in creating the knowledge we need, and we are much more interested in the sensors or in selling, applications and these kind of things. Because definitely the cities are full of evidences, but we need the data and the knowledge that these evidences can bring to us. But of course, this requires a lot of effort and intelligence. I don't know if smart, but intelligence to put the right questions, to be able to change the point of view and these kind of things. But I think we should be optimistic, and because for the coming generations at least.
Il problema che poni, a me mi fa pensare a un'altra cosa, fa pensare insomma alla gestione proprio del dato, no? Quindi la capacità che c'è anche oggi, a causa dell'incredibile quantità, incredibile mole di dati, non per nulla parliamo di big data, di, se vogliamo, passami il termine, talvolta anche di manipolarli. C'era una battuta sugli economisti che diceva che alla fine l'economista riusciva a utilizzare il dato sostanzialmente per dimostrare quello che aveva già deciso prima di guardare il dato. Lo arrangi, lo gestisci.
Completamente.
E un po' oggi, secondo me, abbiamo un po' lo stesso problema, cioè i dati sono talmente tanti che da un lato è difficile capire quali sono quelli giusti, quelli corretti, cioè anche il rischio di avere dati
The relevant.
E poi l'altro problema è come metterli insieme. Quindi io sono convinto che una strada, non dico la strada, ma una strada percorribile sia quella di decidere tutti insieme, la comunità, qual è l'obiettivo. Una volta che è condiviso l'obiettivo che ci si è dati, che è un obiettivo comune, non solo di alcuni, un obiettivo che viene discusso, che viene ragionato. Una volta deciso l'obiettivo si decide come raggiungerlo e quindi come misurare quell'obiettivo. Solo allora io avrò il dato giusto, perché sarà legato all'obiettivo che voglio raggiungere, non genericamente a un valore qualunque, e sarà legato a me come comunità, alle mie identità, al percorso che vorrò fare. Tant'è che secondo me non possiamo pensare di paragonare città diverse senza preoccuparci di aver evidenziato lo specifico obiettivo di ogni città. Cioè, se noi possiamo paragonare qualcosa, dobbiamo paragonare qualcosa, dovremmo paragonare quanto ogni città è capace di raggiungere i propri obiettivi, non di raggiungere un obiettivo valido per tutte, perché se no facciamo omologazione. C'è stato, sai meglio di me, un periodo in cui Barcellona è stato, forse ancora oggi, per molti un riferimento. Tutti volevano essere Barcellona, e non possiamo essere tutti Barcellona, per quanto bellissima. Ognuno è diverso, ogni città è diversa. Però non manca ancora, secondo me, quell'idea per cui ognuno deve individuare i propri obiettivi e essere capace di raggiungerli. Questo un po' però deriva da un problema istituzionale. Lo dico in modo brutto, in Italia c'è un proverbio che dice il pesce puzza dalla testa. Cioè se da livello istituzionale non abbiamo il giusto input, quello arriverà sbagliato anche ai livelli successivi. Come dire, se le stesse istituzioni europee continuano a proporci indicatori e modelli omologanti, necessariamente le istituzioni locali, per attingere a quei fondi e quei finanziamenti, si adatteranno, perché il loro obiettivo sarà riuscire a prendere quei finanziamenti. Quindi io credo che ci debba essere una modifica.
But Luigi, one thing, put it that way. I agree in your point, but you said many things and at the same time. So regarding the data, one of the reasons why I put it in purpose, science, design, and technology, is because data is important. But if we don't have a perspective on a critical approach to that data, all the risks are the one that you were saying. Okay, so that's science, design, and technology. It's not only about technology. We can have a huge capacity, technological capacity, but what for? And by science and design, I mean this capacity. For example, to my students, I always told them, look, proposals don't come from diagnosis. It's not the outcome of a diagnosis. A proposal is a new exercise. It's jumping, from the top of a hill into the void. And with your knowledge, your experience, your backpack, if you are lucky, you will end up having something that goes close to solve what you were, your problem that you were facing. But the diagnosis is not, the outcome of the diagnosis is not a proposal. And we know that as designers. The diagnosis help us to find the arguments why the proposal we are giving as a collective and new exercise, why we are deciding option A and not B. And this is where the data comes into, not the other way around. That's one of the things, misunderstanding that happens with data. And on the other hand, and that's the reason why this idea of the cut and paste solutions around the world is so terrible. And that's the reason why I propose and I put these images in my presentation of housing solutions, on global real estate solutions and so on, because we are stupid enough to keep doing things that we already know they are wrong and that we already have the evidences there. But there is so much For me, there are two things. One is that the decision makers, well, unfortunately, not necessarily always listen to what we are telling them, and that's where the community or the democracy has to come into face. But that's the reason why we need to be critical in the approach. Otherwise, this won't work. But also, I would like to be more optimistic, but also that we, and when I say we at this moment, I'm pointing to the professionals. We need to be more honest and the ethics about our own work. How many legislations have to be reviewed, but they are not fancy. To review legislation is not really, it's not attractive, it's boring. How many of our colleagues sell, all these fancy solutions? They are just smoke. We need to put at the, on the table also the idea of ethics in our own work. And this is something that it's not only about, science. I can add to this science, design, technology, and ethics. And some of the part of this shift that I'm suggesting also means, I like to say, honesty, like to be honest and to see, this can be done, this won't work. I always put the example of the credits in a movie. All the cities around the world wants to be, the first character. They want to be the, I don't know, the Sofia Loren or the Marcello Mastroianni, or they want to be, No, there is no room for all of them. There is no movie if you only have the main characters. You need every single person that is in these credits until the last one, the one that brings the coffee, the one that looks at the light, the one that, all these credits is full of people that do small pieces of the whole process. We need to understand that this is the same here. At the local level, when we work in any project, city, region, country, the planet, it's like a credit in a movie. Each one has a specific role and it's relevant for the whole thing. But not all of them are doing the same thing because it's impossible. They won't be movie at the end of the day. And I like to put this example because it's so, in a way, it shows, it's like these are all the people needed, required for that movie to be done. Great. Then for, in a city, for a city to work, there is so many pieces. But the problem is that we only give credit for the first four. We need to give credit to the rest. And what I like about what I thought during the pandemic was great, or was an opportunity, is that suddenly the change of the point of view show and give credit to things and people and activities that until now were in crisis or undervalued. The agriculture, the grocery down on the street, the idea of being together, the neighborhood, the small community, the proximity. And now suddenly we're talking about the city of the 15 minutes. That I have some critics about that, but this is not the place to talk about that. But so I thought it was interesting because it changed the point of view. And when you are forced to change your point of view, suddenly you realize, you look at the same things differently. So afterwards, when you go back to your original point of view, you will never see the things in the same way. And that's what I think is a chance and an opportunity. Not because it's a change of paradigm and all these big words, empty, all of them, but literally because you were forced to look different. And now we are getting back, but we remember that. We have seen the same reality from another perspective. And this is what I think we have to force ourselves continuously to look at the same reality from a different perspective.